The Red Sea is one of the most transited bodies of water on the planet, and in the months following the outbreak of the regional conflict, it had become something else entirely. A proving ground for a new kind of maritime warfare that the world's most sophisticated naval forces had not fully anticipated, and were still working to counter in real time. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait at its southern end, 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, connects the Indian Ocean to the Suez Canal route that carries roughly 12% of global trade every year. Control of that strait, or even the credible threat of disrupting it, represented a strategic lever of enormous power. And the Houthi forces operating from the Yemeni coastline had recognized that leverage and were using it with a methodical persistence that had forced a significant reorientation of U.S. and coalition naval operations in the region. Operation Prosperity Guardian had placed a persistent naval presence in the southern Red Sea and the approaches to Bab el-Mandeb. The mission was protection of commercial shipping, tankers, container vessels, bulk carriers transiting one of the world's most economically critical corridors under the constant threat of loitering munition attacks launched from the Yemeni coast. The destroyers assigned to the operation rotated through patrol sectors that kept at least one major surface combatant within intercept range of any attack launched from the Yemeni coastline at any point in the transit corridor. It was demanding work, executed continuously, with no defined end state, and an adversary that showed no sign of diminishing its operational tempo regardless of the cost. The destroyer had been on station for 19 days when the engagement began. 19 days of continuous high readiness operations. Not the sustained alert exhaustion of a single crisis event, but the slower, deeper fatigue of nearly 3 weeks in which the crew had never fully stood down, had never fully relaxed the readiness posture, had responded to 11 separate threat alerts in the preceding week alone, most of which had resolved as commercial aircraft or friendly maritime traffic that required positive identification before the threat assessment could be closed. The watch teams were competent and experienced, but they were operating at the outer edge of the cognitive envelope that sustained high-tempo operations produce in human beings regardless of their training or their professionalism. The threat picture on the evening of the engagement had shown elevated Houthi launch activity to the north of the strait. Coastal radar had been tracking increased surface movement in the shallow water areas along the Yemeni coast that the adversary used as staging positions for its fast inshore craft, and the communications intelligence picture had shown the kind of elevated coordination traffic that preceded organized launch operations. None of this was unusual. The threat picture almost always showed some version of this pattern. The difficulty was distinguishing between the pattern that preceded an actual attack and the pattern that was simply the background noise of an adversary that maintained constant operational pressure without necessarily translating every preparation cycle into an executed launch. At 11:47 p.m., the distinction became academic. The ship's SPI radar registered the launch signatures simultaneously from 2 separate bearing sectors, one from the Yemeni coastline approximately 62 nautical miles to the east-northeast, and one from a bearing of 031 degrees at approximately 44 nautical miles, which placed the second launch origin in the shallow coastal waters north of the strait, where the surface movement had been tracked earlier in the evening. The eastern launch signatures were consistent with cruise missile motor ignition, larger thermal bloom, higher initial altitude climb rate. The northern launch signatures were smaller, consistent with one-way attack drone airframes. Both threats were inbound simultaneously. The tactical action officer had 9 contacts on the first assessment sweep, 4 cruise missiles from the eastern bearing, 5 drone contacts from the north. By the time the second radar sweep completed its cycle, the contact count had grown. The drone signatures from the north had split as the individual airframes separated from their initial formation geometry onto individual approach bearings. And 2 additional cruise missile contacts had appeared from the eastern sector that had apparently been masked by terrain clutter in the initial detection sweep. 11 contacts, then 13, then 16 as the full threat picture resolved across 2 seconds of radar update cycles. 16 inbound contacts across 2 simultaneous threat axes, each presenting a different flight profile, a different radar cross-section, and a different optimal intercept solution. The cruise missiles from the east were flying at approximately 150 meters altitude in their transit phase, high enough to clear the coastal terrain, low enough to complicate radar tracking, Their Iranian-manufactured airframes following pre-programmed flight profiles that included multiple waypoints designed to approach the destroyer from an angle that maximized the time they spent in the radar shadow of the Yemeni coastal terrain before emerging into the open water of the Red Sea. The drones from the north were lower, between 8 and 20 meters above the surface, flying a direct approach bearing with terminal phase profiles that the Aegis system's classification algorithms tagged as consistent with a variant optimized for sea-skimming terminal attack. 2 different threats, 2 different intercept envelopes, 1 ship. The TAO's call went out before the contact count had fully stabilized. The engagement doctrine for this operational environment had been developed and rehearsed specifically for this scenario. Simultaneous multi-axis threats combining cruise missiles and drone swarms. Batsikuadiae Nazar Sai Bradisao Nanstilo. Intelligence community had assessed the combined attack architecture as the most likely evolved form of Houthi strike operations, and the fleet had spent the preceding months training against it. The doctrine existed. The training had been done. What the doctrine and training could not fully replicate was the specific texture of executing it at 11:47 p.m. on the 19th day of continuous operations, with a crew that had been running on compressed sleep cycles and sustained alertness for 3 weeks. The SM-2 engagement against the cruise missile tracks opened first. The SM-2 is the workhorse of the ship's outer ring engagement against air-breathing threats. Its semi-active radar guidance is well matched to the profile of cruise missile targets at medium range. And the ship had loaded its VLS cells with a significant SM-2 inventory specifically because the threat environment in the Red Sea had been assessed as predominantly air-breathing rather than ballistic. 3 SM-2 interceptors left the forward VLS cells in a 2-second ripple at 11:48 p.m. and 14 seconds. Their solid rocket motors driving them off the deck on the characteristic flat, fast trajectory that distinguishes a cruise missile intercept solution from the steep climb profile of a ballistic intercept. The deck shuddered with each launch, the blast deflector channels guiding the exhaust outward, the ship's frame transmitting the energy of the launches through every piece of steel in the hull. The first 2 SM-2 intercepts connected at 41 nautical miles. 2 cruise missile tracks blinked off the radar display. The third SM-2 missed, its guidance geometry compromised by the target's terminal evasion maneuver, a sudden altitude drop combined with a bearing deviation that broke the semi-active radar lock with 3 seconds remaining in the intercept window. The missed contact continued inbound. The combat systems officer logged the miss and immediately built a new fire control solution. Second SM-2 launched. The guidance lock on the third missile held this time. Intercept confirmed at 38 miles. 3 of the 4 initial cruise missile contacts neutralized. 1 remaining, now inside 30 miles and closing. 2 additional cruise missiles from the eastern sector, the contacts that had been masked by terrain clutter on initial detection, were now at 47 miles. Their flight profiles resolved. Fire control solutions building. The TAO allocated 2 more SM-2 interceptors to those contacts and returned his attention to the drone threat from the north, which had closed to 31 miles during the 30 seconds the cruise missile engagement had consumed. The drone track count had stabilized at 11. The 5 that had been visible on first detection had been joined by 6 additional contacts that had initially been flying below the radar horizon at extreme range and had only become trackable as they closed. 11 drones, approaching on a fan-shaped spread of bearings from north-northwest through north-northeast. Their dispersion geometry designed to force the ship's engagement systems to cover a wide threat arc, rather than concentrating fire control resources against a narrow approach corridor. The SM-6 engagement against the drone layer opened at 28 miles. The SM-6's active radar seeker gives it a significant advantage over the SM-2 in the drone engagement role. It does not require continuous semi-active illumination from the ship's radar, which means the fire control system can manage more simultaneous engagements without the illuminator resource constraints that limit SM-2 salvo rates against multiple targets. 3 SM-6 interceptors launched in a rapid ripple, each one locked onto a separate drone track, their active seekers guiding them independently to their intercept solutions. 3 drone tracks eliminated at 26 miles, 8 remaining. At 11:50 p.m., the radar processing system generated an alert that nobody in the CIC wanted to see. 2 of the 11 drone contacts had separated from the main body's approach geometry at some point during the outer ring engagement and had descended to approximately 3 meters above the surface. Below the ship's radar tracking floor for that range bracket, invisible for a period that the system estimated at between 40 and 70 seconds, before the contacts re-emerged on the radar picture. Inside 15 miles. Having used the detection gap to close a significant portion of the distance between their previous tracked position and the ship's hull, the contacts had intentionally exploited the radar floor. They had flown below it for the duration of the gap and re-emerged inside the outer ring engagement envelope, appearing on the display at a range where the available intercept time was measured in seconds, not minutes. The tactic was not improvised. It was precisely the kind of adaptive behavior that the intelligence community had assessed as the leading edge of Houthi drone employment doctrine: the integration of radar terrain masking and surface-hugging flight profiles into a deliberate gap exploitation strategy designed to defeat layered defense architecture by using the physics of the radar system against it. 11 miles, 2 contacts, approximately 4 minutes to hull impact at current closure rate. The ESSM engagement against the 2 close contacts opened immediately. The evolved Sea Sparrow's guidance system is well adapted to close-range, low-altitude engagements. Its compact airframe and high agility make it effective against the kind of maneuvering drone contact that presents a more difficult intercept geometry than a straight and level cruise missile target. The first ESSM connected at 9 miles. 1 contact eliminated. The second close contact executed a bearing change at 8 miles. Not a random deviation, but a specific lateral displacement that moved it out of the ESSM's projected intercept cone by approximately 12 degrees. The ESSM's guidance system attempted to compensate. The intercept miss was narrow. The warhead detonated within lethal fragmentation range of the target's airframe, and the contact's radar return changed character in the milliseconds following the detonation, suggesting partial airframe damage. But the contact continued. Damaged, but functional. Still closing. A second ESSM was already in the air, launched 1.3 seconds after the first, built on a revised fire control solution that accounted for the bearing change. The second intercept connected at 6 miles. Contact eliminated. The remaining drone contacts from the main body, 6 tracks still active after the SM-6 and initial ESSM engagements, were now inside 20 miles and distributing across a wide bearing spread that required the fire control system to simultaneously manage intercept solutions, covering a 60-degree threat arc. 3 more ESSM launches in rapid sequence. 2 contacts eliminated. 4 remaining. While the ESSM engagement against the drone layer continued, the 2 remaining cruise missiles from the eastern sector had closed to 18 miles. The SM-2 intercepts allocated to them earlier had connected. 1 confirmed, 1 miss. The surviving cruise missile was now inside the ESSM engagement envelope, its flight profile showing an altitude decrease consistent with a transition from transit phase to terminal phase, the point at which a cruise missile drops to its lowest approach altitude and accelerates to maximum speed for the final geometry of the attack. The TAO was managing 4 simultaneous engagement threads at 11:51 p.m. 1 inbound cruise missile in terminal phase at 17 miles. 4 drone contacts distributed across a 60-degree arc inside 20 miles. 2 contacts from the drone layer that the ESSM had not yet engaged. And an aft sector alert from the surface search radar, a small contact, barely above the noise floor of the radar's surface clutter, appearing at 11 miles to the southwest, moving fast, consistent with a surface-launched munition from a platform that had been below the radar horizon throughout the engagement. The surface contact was not in the pre-engagement intelligence picture. It had not appeared during the opening phases of the attack. It appeared now, at the moment of maximum engagement complexity, when the fire control system's resources were most heavily committed, and the TAO's cognitive load was at its absolute peak. The small surface contact resolved on the second radar sweep as a sea-skimming munition. probably a short-range anti-ship missile launched from a small surface platform that had been lying low in the coastal shallow-water environment to the southwest throughout the duration of the engagement, waiting for exactly this moment. A desperation move. A final card played at the moment when the defender's attention was maximally divided. The aft CIWS mount acquired the surface contact at 10 miles. It was not a drone. It was faster, lower, and its radar cross-section was consistent with a small anti-ship missile body. The CIWS mount tracked it continuously as it closed, its fire control computer, building the intercept solution, and waiting for the contact to enter effective engagement range. At the same moment, the TAO redirected one ESSM from the drone engagement queue to the surface contact, accepting the risk of reduced coverage against the drone layer in order to put a guided interceptor on the most dangerous single contact in the current threat picture. The ESSM launched at 11:51 p.m. and 33 seconds, tracking down the bearing to the southwest. The cruise missile from the eastern sector reached the ship's CIWS engagement range at 11:51 p.m. and 41 seconds. The forward CIWS mount had been tracking it through its terminal phase approach, waiting for the geometry to enter effective range. The engagement opened at approximately 2 nautical miles. The contact was fast. Faster than a drone, faster than the approach profile that the CIWS tracking system encounters most frequently in exercise environments. And the first burst required a tracking correction before the second burst connected. The cruise missile airframe was struck at approximately 1.4 miles from the hull. The terminal phase of its approach carried the disintegrating airframe close enough to the ship that the debris pattern, composite material, fuel, structural fragments, reached the forward deck before the ship's motion carried it clear. 3 crew members on the forward deck watch were struck by minor debris. 2 sustained superficial lacerations. 1 was knocked to the deck by the pressure wave of the disintegration and sustained a sprained wrist in the fall. None required anything beyond immediate first aid. The forward deck plating sustained 3 visible impact marks, where larger debris fragments had struck. No penetration of the structural steel, no compromise of any system beneath. The ESSM interceptor reached the surface contact at 11 miles to the southwest and connected cleanly. The contact blinked off the radar display. The 4 remaining drone contacts were inside 8 miles when the CIWS mounts and remaining ESSM inventory turned to engage them. The forward mount was still completing its damage assessment cycle following the cruise missile engagement, a process that took approximately 40 seconds, as the automated systems verified that the mount's barrel assembly and tracking hardware had not sustained any degradation from the proximity of the debris impact. During those 40 seconds, the aft CIWS mount carried the drone engagement alone. 3 contacts eliminated by the aft mount at ranges between 3 miles and 1.1 miles. The 4th contact, the last remaining active threat in the entire engagement, reached 580 meters from the hull before the forward CIWS mount completed its reactivation cycle and both mounts converged on it simultaneously. The disintegration was close enough that the pressure wave reached the ship's port bridge wing, where the officer of the deck instinctively stepped back from the bridge wing door, before the rational analysis of what had just happened completed itself in his mind. The fragments from the airframe struck the upper portion of the bridge wing windscreen, reinforced glass designed to withstand this kind of secondary impact, and cracked it across 2/3 of its width without penetrating. At 11:53 p.m. and 12 seconds, the radar picture was clear. 5 minutes and 25 seconds of continuous engagement from first detection to last intercept. The ship's weapons expenditure log read: 9 SM-2 interceptors, 7 SM-6 interceptors, 11 ESSM interceptors, approximately 3,200 rounds of 20 millimeters through both CIWS mounts. 3 crew members with minor injuries. Cracked bridge wing windscreen. Forward deck debris impacts. No flooding. No fire. No loss of any operational system. The replacement cost of the expended interceptors, approximately $44 million. The estimated cost of the entire Houthi attack package, cruise missiles, drones, and the surface-launched munition, based on post-engagement intelligence assessment, between $1.2 and $2 million. The formation's mission log was updated. 1 threat engagement resolved. Patrol continued. But resolved was a word that fit the engagement and not the situation. The ship had 19 days remaining in its assigned patrol rotation. Its VLS cells were now meaningfully depleted. Not critically, not to the point where the commanding officer would call for an early logistics rendezvous, but enough that the depth of the defensive inventory was reduced in ways that would matter if a comparable attack occurred in the next several days before the scheduled replenishment. The crew was more tired than they had been at 11:46 p.m. The bridge wing windscreen was cracked. The 3 injured crew members were in the medical bay, which was not a significant personnel impact, but was a reminder of the physical reality that this was not an exercise. The Houthi command structure, for its part, would review the engagement through whatever intelligence means it had available. Commercial satellite imagery, signals intercept, reporting from maritime observers in the corridor, and would draw conclusions from what it observed. It would know which approach geometry had produced the radar floor exploitation that generated the 2 close contacts. It would note the timing of the surface-launched munition relative to the peak engagement complexity. It would refine. It would plan again. It would launch again. The Red Sea does not resolve. It accumulates. The watch rotation turned over at midnight. The new watch team received the threat brief, the weapons status update, the maintenance discrepancy list, and the intelligence summary for the next 12 hours. They took their positions at their consoles and looked at the radar picture, which showed nothing unusual. Commercial traffic in the lanes. The familiar pattern of a maritime corridor that looked, in the absence of an active threat, like nothing more than what it was. They knew better. 19 days of operations had taught them that the absence of a visible threat was not the absence of threat. It was just the interval between threats. The job was not to wait for the interval to end. The job was to be ready when it did. In this corridor, readiness is not a posture. It is a cost that is paid continuously, in attention and exhaustion and depleted magazines and cracked windscreens, by the people who stand the watch so that 12% of the world's trade can move through 20 miles of contested water without knowing what it cost to make that movement possible. The watch holds because people hold it. That is the only reason it holds at all.